Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of San Francisco, a welcoming community for the liberal spirit. Are there any liberal spirits here today? I can't hear you. Are there any liberal spirits here today? Well, you've found the right place. My name is Greg Stewart, and I serve this congregation as its senior minister. In this religious community, we do not teach people what to think. Instead, we teach them how to think for themselves. For we believe that this present age needs more folk who can make up their own minds about what the evidence leads them to believe. So wherever you are on your spiritual journey, you are welcome here. With all of your doubts and all of your certainties, you are one of us. To all who are here this morning, I say, or this afternoon, I say, welcome home. And now at this time, church member Dolores Perez Priam will introduce our distinguished guest. Dolores?
Before I start, could I please ask you all to turn off your cell phones? Thank you. I want to say a few words about our esteemed guest, Noam Chomsky, who we all respect and admire. When I asked Professor Chomsky to come to speak to us at the Unitarian Universalist Society on behalf of Unitarian Universalists for Peace, San Francisco, and the School of the Americas Watch, San Francisco, he only agreed to come because he wanted to talk directly to activists. And here we are, right? As the title of this event suggests, our nation is in crisis. We need to hear the words and ideas of this insightful man. Like many of you, whenever I hear or read Noam Chomsky, I am inspired and challenged. He analyzes for us the inaccuracies of the theories and political misinformation with which we are inundated every day as we try to clarify the issues of our times. Without clarity, we cannot achieve solutions. In trying to address the problems of our society, whether to stop the wars, defend civil rights, or achieve social justice, we have had strong intuitions about what we must do to make things better. Dr. Chomsky's research and writings have not only confirmed our intuition, but have provided answers to these concerns and have emboldened us to walk the path of activism through rethinking, reconsidering, and recommitment to our work. I come to you today to introduce Noam Chomsky and to thank him and acknowledge how grateful we are for his prophetic voice and a lifetime of sharing his scholarship and truth with us. So with gratitude for his generosity of spirit, let's give him a big, warm San Francisco welcome.
I guess I misread the program and thought that David was going to talk. Okay, well, I was asked to discuss three major crises. One, the two wars going on in the Middle East, Iraq, and what's now called AFPAC, Afghanistan, Pakistan. The second, crises in Latin America, and third, the economic crisis at home. Unfortunately, that doesn't exhaust the list, but I'll keep to those. The three speakers afterwards will go into these areas in more detail. I thought it would be useful for me just to open with a couple of words of background. Partly the reason for that is that policies have been stable for a very long time. I'll start with the Second World War, but it's just like today. The policies are pretty much fixed. Despite the huge changes in the world system, the policies remain the same, adapted to new circumstances. Pretty much bipartisan. Sometimes one of the parties goes off the edge, the way George W. Bush did, gets bitterly attacked even in the mainstream. He's went off to a kind of radical extremism that harmed the interests of the main policy, sources of policy, which is mostly in the private economy. It was harming them, so he pull it back, now back in the mainstream again. But the basic concepts and thinking are very stable. And it's important to understand that. And they're stable because they're based in institutions, and the institutions are stable. So things change, but power continues to reside in pretty much the same sectors. And they're thinking about the world and plans about how to deal with the world correspondingly are pretty much invariant. So go back to World War II and just think about foreign policy. During World War II, from 1939 to 1945, there were high-level meetings of high officials of the Roosevelt administration, State Department, planners, and others from the Council on Foreign Relations, the main extra-governmental input into foreign policy. And they took for granted from 1939 that the war was going to end with the U.S. in a dominant position in the world. The U.S. was going to replace Britain as the world dominant power. The only question is how dominant. And they developed a concept which they called the Grand Area. The Grand Area was going to be a region where the United States, I'll quote some of the phrases, would hold unquestioned power with military and economic supremacy throughout the Grand Area, and would act to ensure the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by any state that might interfere with its global designs. Well, that's the Bush Doctrine from 2002, which caused such anger and fury. Pretty much the same. And it's been, I won't go through the record, but it's been pretty much the same from 1939 till today. Before the World War, the United States was the richest country in the world by far, but it wasn't really a major player in the world. It was in the hemisphere, and to an extent in the Pacific. It had entered the Middle East, sort of horned its way into the Middle East, but still Britain was the major player, though not the richest one. Well, they knew that was going to change. So what would the Grand Area be? Well, at a minimum, the Grand Area was going to include the entire Western Hemisphere, the traditional backyard, the Far East. Other powers, including the victims of Japanese aggression, were kept out of the arrangements of the San Francisco Peace Treaty and that formally ended the Pacific War. The Asian countries, except for the Philippines, which was a colony, just refused to attend because their interests were eliminated. The charges against the Japanese, even the trials, began in December 7th, 1941. That's 10 years after Japanese aggression over Asia, devastating effects. So they just stayed away, even India. So the Far East was going to be included in the Grand Area. The former British Empire, all of it, which the United States would take over, and of course the Middle East. That's the Grand Area at the beginning. They assumed at the time that Germany would survive the war and, in fact, be a dominant power in Eurasia, so there would be a U.S.-controlled world with the borders that I mentioned and a German-controlled world. Well, as the Russians began to wear down the German forces, the Wehrmacht, it became clear, it was becoming clear by about 1943 that Germany was not going to survive the war. So the Grand Area planning expanded to include as much of Eurasia as possible, but certainly Western Europe, which is the commercial, industrial, economic core of Eurasia was at the time. Well, that's the grand area. And this conception of world order remains constant. Terminology changes. Everybody's familiar with the Bush II doctrine. People are less familiar with the Clinton doctrine, which was actually more extreme than Bush. It was just presented with a quiet voice, not brazen arrogance, didn't arouse antagonism. According to the Clinton doctrine was that the U.S. has the right to use force anywhere to protect markets and resources. Now that's considerably more extreme than Bush II. Bush II and his planners insisted on pretexts, like you had to have you're trying to establish democracy, or trying to eliminate weapons of mass destruction, or whatever it might be. But the Clinton doctrine required no pretext. Just, we want to control markets and resources. If there's any barrier to that, we have a right to use force. In fact, if you read the documents of the Clinton era on the use of nuclear weapons, for example, they're just mind-blowing. I think they're the most extreme ever. That's Clinton. We're now back to a kind of a Clinton period, more in the center, but that's what the center is. Well, going back to 1945, the Grand Area Planning laid detailed plans to how to run it, and sophisticated plans. And they're very significant because they were in fact implemented. Not surprisingly, it was pretty much the same people who were running the State Department, the new National Security Council, and so on after the war. So what you look at the post-war history, it pretty much implements these plans. Well, the basic idea was that each region of the world in the Grand Area was assigned what they called its function. For the global south, third world, the function is essentially to provide resources, markets, investment opportunities, cheap labor, later other services like export of waste and pollution, which is a major factor now. So that's the function of the South. At the time, the United States wasn't much interested in Africa. So the planners, George Kennan, wrote the basic documents. He decided that we should give Africa to the Europeans to exploit. That's the term that was used for their reconstruction from wartime damage. I mean, if you think about historical relations between Europe and Africa, you can kind of imagine a different relationship, but that apparently never even crossed anyone's mind. There's no discussion of it. So we'll hand it over to the Europeans to exploit. Middle East oil reserves were different. We're going to take them. In fact, the U.S. had already started taking them. There was a mini-war going on between Britain and the United States during the Second World War over who was going to control Saudi Arabian concessions. That was understood by the 1930s to be the jewel in the crown. And in fact, U.S. planners were worried that, as they put it politely, the British are trying to diddle us out of our concessions in Saudi Arabia by giving the ruling, tyrants gifts. So therefore, Roosevelt was convinced to declare Saudi Arabia to be, its newly created Saudi Arabia, to be a democratic state helping in the struggle against fascism. That made it eligible for Lend-Lease aid, so we could buy off the royal family to grant us the concessions. The British didn't like it, but they were in a weak position, of course. That was the Middle East, and there was no question about who was going to run that. Back in the mid-40s, it was described, the State Department, as a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. When Eisenhower came along, he called it the most strategically important area in the world. One of the top planners, a Berle New Dealer, pointed out that control over Middle East oil would provide the United States with substantial control of the world. So that's no small prize. And hanging on to the Middle East is critically important. That's basically the background of the wars going on in Iraq and AfPak. even Afghanistan. It has some resources, but it's in a strategic position, the edge of the Middle East oil resources and also now the Central Asian ones. So one critical element in the background of planning in Afghanistan is whether the U.S. can finally implement a plan that's been around for years, through the Clinton years, to set up a pipeline that would go from Turkmenistan, which has a ton of natural gas, to India, which means we'd have to go through Afghanistan and through Kandahar province, where the Canadian troops are, to Pakistan, through Pakistan and to India. And the point of that is dual. One is to keep Russia from getting it. Most of it goes to Russia now, and there's kind of a battle over, pipeline battle over who controls Central Asian resources. They're not comparable to the Gulf, but they're substantial. And the other reason is just to try to intensify the U.S. effort to isolate Iran, the natural source for India for fossil fuel, petroleum, and so on, is Iran. And there are plans for an Iranian-Pakistani pipeline, and the U.S. wants to block that. And the idea is if you can provide a Turkmenistan through Afghanistan, Pakistan pipeline, that'll keep the Indians away from making deals with Iran. India is playing a complicated game on this. They're not quite going along, but partially so. The U.S.-India nuclear arrangements last year, which essentially exempted India from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, allows the United States to contribute to their nuclear programs, which of course means indirectly their nuclear weapons program. It's also partly seen against that background, part of the effort to prevent Iranian entry into the world. And this is a pretty serious business. There now is, as you may know, a China-based regional alliance, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes China, of course, Russia, all the Central Asian states, Mongolia, and it has as observers Pakistan, India, and Iran. The United States asked for observer status and was turned down, so it doesn't have observer status. And they've already passed resolutions calling for ending of all U.S. bases in Central Asia. There's a lot of jockeying about that. And they're also making moves, especially China, towards the Middle East, the real investments in Saudi Arabia and so on. And that's really threatening because that's, remember, the most strategically important part of the world, mainly Saudi Arabia. And if you control that, you can control the world. So there's a lot at stake. What's in the background of Afghanistan and Iraq is not slight. I mean, Iraq itself has probably the second largest oil reserves in the world. Well, you'll hear more about that later. Let's turn quickly to Latin America. In Latin America, the internal documents, which have since been released, make this planning extremely clear. It's back around 1950. They identify the primary threat to U.S. interests in Latin America as radical and nationalistic regimes that appeal to the masses of the population and seek to satisfy the popular demand for immediate improvement in the low living standards of the masses and development for domestic needs. I mean, if this kind of stuff sounds like it's coming out of a Maoist pamphlet, it's not surprising. The business classes are dedicated Marxists, vulgar Marxists, just the values are inverted. And they are always talking about the masses and this and that and what we have to do to control them. So the rhetoric is kind of like Maoist pamphlets, just different values, not so different sometimes. Well, the radical and nationalist regimes that appeal to the masses of the population, they want development for domestic needs. Those tendencies conflict. I'm still reading National Security Council, conflict with demand for a political and economic climate conducive to private investment, which means, of course, U.S. investment, and with adequate repatriation of profits and protection of our raw materials. That's George Kennan again. They're our raw materials by accident. They happen to be somewhere else, but we've got to protect them. And Kennan, in fact, is considered a kind of at the humanist fringe of planning, was very much in favor of supporting police states and violent repression to ensure the protection of our resources and our interests in Latin America. This conception is not just applied to Latin America. The United States is a global power, so you find the same thinking all over the world. For example, when the U.S., to take a currently crucial case, Iran, when the U.S. and Britain overthrew the parliamentary government of Iran in 1953 and installed a brutal tyrant who reigned until 1979, the New York Times, expressing the doctrinal wing of the power system, their editors published an editorial praising, they knew what was happening, no secret about it, praising the overthrow of the parliamentary government and saying that it will provide an object lesson to underdeveloped countries with rich resources that go berserk with fanatical nationalism. Now they'll see what happens to them if they try to take our resources. They were thinking of trying to nationalize our resources there. So this was a good thing, and installing the Shah was fine. They said it's going to be more troubles like this elsewhere, but maybe sensible leaders will understand the penalty they pay if they try to interfere with Grand Area Planning, our military and economic supremacy and access to the resources and raw materials and markets which are ours by right. That's why you never get any criticism of anything in the doctrinal system. There are criticisms of U.S. power because it's costing too much. So like, say, Obama, he's considered a principled critic of the Iraq War. His criticism, if you look back, was that it was a strategic blunder. It's costing too much, not going to work, and so on. In fact, what he said was pretty much what you could read in Pravda in 1985 when the Russians had invaded Afghanistan. In the press, there were condemnations of it as strategic blunder. It's going to cost too much. We're not going to get enough. It's not worth it. In fact, if we had records, I'm sure you could have heard it in discussions of the German General Staff after Stalingrad, when they recognized that a two-front war was a strategic blunder. Should have knocked out England and then gone after Russia. So there is criticism of strategic blunders and errors and failures of that kind, but that's about the limit. And anywhere in the doctrinal system, maybe way out at the fringes, something else, but it's very constant. Vietnam War is a perfect example, no time. Well, continuing with another aspect of planning back in the 1940s with regard to Latin America is that we must make sure that they avoid what was called excessive industrialization. Excessive means competing with the U.S. So if they want to develop a steel industry, say in Brazil, that's okay, but should be the kind of steel that we don't want to bother producing, low-cost, low-tech steel, but not competing with us. So we've got to block excessive industrialization policies that are directed to improving the low living standards of the masses and so on. And a good bit of the history of the U.S. and Latin America, right up till today, is just the playing out of this thinking. It's pretty familiar. Back in the 18th century, Adam Smith, who was essentially preaching in a more nuanced form than today, but pretty much the same ideas that we preach to the Third World. He advised the American colonies after liberation to follow the proper principles of economic thinking, which are still the proper principles. His advice was that the newly liberated colonies should follow what we now call their comparative advantage. Do what you're good at. So send fish and agricultural products and fur and so on, but don't import superior British goods. That's economically efficient. Anything else would violate the holy principles of economics, which haven't changed much. He also urged the United States not to make the mistake of trying to monopolize its resources, but rather leave them open to the world, meaning primarily England at that time. That's economic realism, the same doctrines preached by the World Bank and the IMF to the third world. Well, the United States didn't follow the advice. Alexander Hamilton, who ran the economy, ran a state-directed economy. He set up huge, very high tariffs. The U.S. had the highest tariffs in the world during the period of its economic growth, huge economic growth. Keep out cheaper British manufacturers. That's how the U.S. was able to develop a textile industry and everything that spun off the textile industry, its first stage of industrialization. Later, steel industry, same, didn't use superior British steel. What's now called piracy and barred by the World Trade Organization, namely taking superior technology from more advanced countries and using it and adapting it. Very extensive state intervention in the economy. All of this went on right until the Second World War. By that time, the U.S. was far and away the richest country in the world. Everybody else was destroyed. And it was sort of willing to toy with some version of free trade because you figured we're going to win, so let's have free trade. But it didn't end there. In fact, that began the biggest period of state intervention in the economy in the United States, which runs right up till today. And that's the development of high-tech industry. I mean, if you use the internet and computers, lasers, fly on airplanes, that kind of thing, it's most of the work's coming out of the state sector, serious work. So the taxpayer's paying for it, and ultimately, if anything works, it gets privatized. And the fundamental system is that cost and risk are socialized, and profit is privatized, and we call it free markets. But the U.S. didn't follow the advice of the best economists, and therefore prospered. There were countries that had to follow that advice because they had not freed themselves from British force. India, Egypt, Britain, France, and others. And that's basically where the division between the first and third world began to take off. In the 18th century, India and China were the most advanced sectors of the world in industry, commerce, public health, and many other respects. Well, that's with regard to Mexico, the crucial part of Latin America. There was further thinking. So in around 1990, there was a strategy development workshop at the Pentagon evaluating U.S.-Mexico relations. And they found these relations to be, in their words, extraordinarily positive. I mean, not troubled by stolen elections, huge repression, and crushing of the labor movement. All of that was fine. So everything was extraordinarily positive, but they did see a cloud on the horizon. The cloud was what they called a democracy opening in Mexico, which they feared might bring into office a government more interested in challenging the United States on economic and nationalist grounds, violating grand area thinking. And they had a cure. They recommended a U.S., and so did others, a U.S.-Mexican treaty which would lock Mexico in to the neoliberal reforms of the 1980s and would tie the hands of current and future governments of Mexico, because they'd be bound by treaty to keep to this, and that would avert the threat of a democracy opening. Well, there's a name for the outcome of that. It's called NAFTA. That's basically what it is. Other things too, but that's core purpose, and that was understood. And the same year that Clinton introduced, rammed NAFTA through into implementation over the opposition of the American population, incidentally. But that same year, 1994, Clinton also began to militarize the Mexican-U.S. border. It had been an open border. Like most borders, it was established by force, by conquest, and pretty much the same people lived on both sides of the border, cross the border to visit your relatives and friends and so on. But in 1994, Clinton initiated what was called Operation Gatekeeper to militarize the border. And we don't have internal documents from that period, but if they were to come out, I'm pretty sure what you're going to see is that they understood that they're going to destroy the Mexican economy. Mexican agriculture won't be able to compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, so peasants will be driven off the farms. U.S. businesses won't be able to compete with U.S.-based multinationals, which under NAFTA have to have the rights of persons, of people, rights of Mexicans, national treatment it's called. If a Mexican comes to the United States, he doesn't get national treatment. If he asks for that, he'll end up in Guantanamo. But if a U.S. corporation goes to Mexico, they have to get national treatment, which means the Mexican businesses won't be able to compete, and you get destruction of that part of the Mexican economy. And so it'll almost inevitably lead to a flow of people fleeing from the wreckage of the Mexican economy, and they'll be joined, in fact already we're being joined by the people fleeing from Reagan's terrorist wars in Central America. So we've got to do something about it. So that's the militarization of the border, which is, of course, still going on. Complicated story. Well, with regard to Latin America altogether, though it was also understood, our control over Latin America was understood to be very critical. Nixon's National Security Council declared in secret, now public, that if we can't control Latin America, how are we going to control the rest of the world? So at least we got to control that. So it was no joke. That was at the moment when they were planning the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile. And the reasoning was very much the same as what the New York Times expressed with regard to Iran in 1953. We have to have an object lesson to countries that go berserk with radical nationalism and challenge our domination of their economies and don't perform the services they're supposed to perform when we've assigned them their function. As Kissinger put it, Chile, if there's a democratic socialist development in Chile, it could be what he called a virus that would spread contagion elsewhere. He thought it would spread contagion all the way to southern Europe. He didn't think that Chilean army was going to land in Rome. He thought that it would be a model that southern European social democrats, in those days called Euro-communists, might want to follow, might inspire them to go on. And therefore you got to stop it right away. That's a leading principle of international affairs. It's not studied very much, and there isn't any name for it, but it ought to be called the mafia principle. The Godfather does not tolerate disobedience. And if some small storekeeper doesn't pay protection money, maybe the Godfather doesn't need it or won't even notice it, but you can't let them get away with it, no matter how small they are, because it could be a virus that would spread contagion. Others might say, okay, we'll do it too. And if you look over the history of the period since the Second World War, one leading theme is the mafia principle. It has very striking applications. No time to talk about them, but happening right now. That's, in fact, Iran is a case in point. U.S. policy in Iran, or U.S. policy towards Cuba, is overriding public opinion in the U.S., but that's normal. Public opinion's not considered relevant unless it's organized and active, and too much of a nuisance, but it's not in these cases. But what's more interesting about Iran and Cuba is that U.S. policy is overriding major economic interests. So in the case of Cuba, agribusiness, energy corporations, pharmaceutical corporations want to establish normal relations, just as the large majority of the American population do, for their own interests. But that's not going to be allowed. And the reason is very clear. It was stated back in the days of the Kennedy administration very clearly. Cuba is engaged in what was called successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine. And that cannot be tolerated. As Arthur Schlesinger put it, he was Kennedy's Latin American advisor, the real threat of Cuba, he said, is Castro's idea of taking matters into your own hands and working for the interests of your own population, is that could appeal to others in Latin America who are faced with the same problems, and therefore we better get rid of it right there. No successful defiance can be tolerated. And the savagery of the U.S. attack against Cuba is really quite incredible. And not just the terrorist wars, which are bad enough, but the details of the surveillance of Cuba to make sure that if any ship stops anywhere in the world and picks up something that has a little bit of Cuban nickel in it, they've got to be barred from international commerce. The U.S. expends enormous efforts on that and has for 50 years. And that makes sense. You cannot accept successful defiance. It's just too dangerous. Same in Iran. American energy corporations would be happy to go in and exploit Iran's resources, and they're usually influential. I'll stop in a second. But they're being overridden in this case because Iran has also been engaged in successful defiance since 1979. Well, I was going to say something about the situation at home, but I'll leave that for the moment. It's, in brief, everything's happening exactly as you should expect. You take a look at Obama's financial base. It's mostly financial industries. So, yes, they're getting wonderful gifts, and they're very happy about it. Business press is gloating about months ago. The business was gloating that the insurers have won the health care battle. Yeah, they're getting everything they wanted. The big banks that caused the crisis are better off than before. They've been merged into still bigger banks, which means that they get the huge government insurance policy, which is called too big to fail. So you ought to take risks. Makes sense to take risks because you'll make a lot of money out of it, and you're going to be paid off when things go wrong, as they surely will. So there's nothing unpredictable about it. Oh, one last comment on the gap between public opinion and public policy, which is very significant. Technical name for it, it's called a democratic deficit. That's evident on health care, on the bailout, on foreign policy, just about everywhere you look. It's been pretty well studied, in fact. Now, that's not a law of nature. It doesn't have to be that way. It's been overcome in the past by militant, organized, dedicated action, and it can be again. That's the only word I'll say about hope, because you people are the hope, so I don't have to talk to you about it.
Well, buenos días a todos y todos. Afternoon. First of all, thank you again, Dr. Chomsky, for an incredibly enlightening lecture and something to think about for a long time. My name is David Bacon. I'm going to moderate the rest of this panel here today. And this is intended to be a dialogue between Dr. Chomsky and activists or people who are active in our local community here. And because we are concentrating on what the meaning is for our community here, I want to say, first of all, it's a great thing that we are meeting in this church here. This was the church where slavery was defeated in California, and Thomas Starr King, who's memorialized on the wall there, was the main reason why California came into the United States as a free state and why we never had slavery and plantations here. Right across the street is the International Longshore and Warehouse Union. And it was the general strike here in San Francisco that made our community and the politics of our community so much of what it is today. So this is a good place for us to meet and to talk about all of this. What we are going to do today is we're going to have 3 separate presentations, short presentations, and then we're going to ask Dr. Chomsky to respond to them. And I think that by that time we're going to have to dog this one off because our time will have run out. So to begin with, I want to introduce our first presenter, Antonia Juhasz. Antonia and I share an interest in Iraq and the oil in Iraq, and I think we owe her a great debt of gratitude because we've all said all the way along that the war in Iraq was a war for oil, but it was Antonia that really put that into the media and into the national political discourse here. She wrote 2 books, one of them about oil itself, The Tyranny of Oil, and also The Bush Agenda, Invading the World One Economy at a Time. She's an associate fellow for the Institute for Policy Studies and currently is the director of the Freedom from Oil campaign at Global Exchange here and a policy analyst with Foreign Policy in Focus. Her bio notes that she was arrested multiple times. In fact, I think all of us have been arrested multiple times, and maybe we should announce how many times and see who comes out the winner here. In any case, Antonia?
Thank you. Arrested 4 times in the cause of peace. All of my arrests in the cause of peace. Well, this is an incredible honor. You all came here to hear Professor Chomsky. Professor Chomsky came here because he wanted to be in a room of activists, and he required that there be activists here to make sure that you all get involved in activism. So I have 5 minutes, not enough time to go into depth about oil and Iraq and Afghanistan. Fortunately, I have several books which are for sale outside, which you can read on these topics. But I am going to spend my time making sure that I fulfill this promise, which is making sure that you all hear the hope that was at the end of Professor Chomsky's presentation. And while, as we all know, we have seen the same agenda being pursued by U.S. governments decade after decade after decade, there are some pretty important differences at the extreme, and 2 of those important differences are the extent and willingness of the government at hand to utilize the military to advance those objectives, and the other is the extent of the government at hand to utilize itself to intervene on behalf of public interests in the market, or intervene on the behalf of, intervene with corporate interests on behalf of the public interests. We are at probably the most critical moment in the long histories of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan this week, right now. We have a government that I believe is genuinely, honestly, debating what it should do right now in Afghanistan. Should it increase troops by 40,000, or should it figure out a timetable for full withdrawal? If anyone has been listening, watching the news this morning, General James Jones, the National Security Council advisor, has been hitting the airwaves saying that there is a conflict within the administration between the military asking for 40,000 troops and the administration which is trying to rethink its strategy. But the other thing that he continually emphasizes is the regional significance of Afghanistan, that it's not just Afghanistan, it's the region. And as Professor Chomsky said, how Afghanistan is generally referred to by people like General James Jones, whose previous job before he joined the Obama administration was the head of the Institute for 21st Century Energy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. He was the oil industry's main lobbying representative, with his core function being to try and better unite U.S. energy and military policy. General James Jones is the head of the National Security Council now, and the way that he refers to Afghanistan is as the energy corridor. So it's Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan. There's a lot of oil up there, and it has to get out to here some way, and that's Afghanistan and Pakistan. However, we are at a moment where for the first time, the majority of the American public opposes the war in Afghanistan. Almost 60% of the American public opposes the war. Almost 70% of Democrats oppose the war. And there is real internal debate within the Congress, within the administration itself, on what is the right method to deal with attempting to hold on to this oil, right? So the U.S. government has always tried and always has used the military to get oil. But how much military? There's a reason why the Clinton administration did not fully invade Iraq, but instead did aerial bombardment, right? And then the Bush administration came in, and it brought in, at this point now, hundreds of thousands of troops that have occupied the nation, brought in troops in Afghanistan that have now been occupying the nation. And on Wednesday, we start the 9th year of the invasion of Afghanistan. That's this Wednesday. This week, the Congress is debating the Defense Authorization Bill. This week, the Obama administration has said that in this week or the next week, it's going to decide on its strategy for Afghanistan. And as I keep saying, there is immense dissension within the ranks of the Democratic Party, even among conservative Republicans, even among Republicans, that the U.S. military should be being utilized as it is at this moment, that it isn't rather a better idea to pull the military back and use different devices to make sure that we hold on to that oil. I think we all are in the column that firmly believe that the military shouldn't be being used. 8 U.S. soldiers and 2 Afghanistan police officers were killed just yesterday in Afghanistan. August was the highest death toll for U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Since from January to August, 1,500 Afghani citizens have been killed. And I want to read you a very important poll that just came out. Because this is AFPAC now, right? And when they talk about regional security, the focus is on Afghanistan and Pakistan. 80% of Pakistanis just polled said that they are opposed to U.S. assistance in Pakistan's fight against terrorism. That's a 20% increase since March. We are creating more enemies, right, with a military presence. The military needs to come home. Now, you have a lot of ways that you can make it happen this week. This week is when the debate is happening. This week is when the money is being authorized, when the strategy is being set. This is the week to act. So on Monday, there are protests happening at Lockheed Martin's facility in Sunnyvale, targeting the military contractors, beneficiaries. On Wednesday, there are vigils being held. On Saturday, the 17th, there's a rally protest that starts at Civic Center. But in between, what you need to do during this week is this is the week where it really matters, where you need to call your elected officials. You need to contact the Obama administration, because believe me, the other side is. So what has happened in the shift in administrations, moving from essentially an oil administration to essentially a finance administration, is that the oil lobby has dramatically increased its financial presence, its lobbying presence on Capitol Hill with Congress and with the Obama administration. It's never spent more money on lobbying than it's spent in the just so far this year, and the year isn't even over. Believe me, they're hearing from the other guys. They need to hear from you this week. You need to make a call. You need to write a letter. You need to participate in a protest. You need to stand up in a vigil. You need to contact all the amazing activist organizations that are dripping from the banisters in a city like San Francisco. And you need to do it this week. And we also have an amazing, great local target. The Chevron Corporation. My actual title isn't the head of the Freedom from Oil campaign, it's the head of the Chevron program. I stopped writing so that I could target Chevron. They're the 5th largest corporation in the world, the largest corporation in California. They have been and continue to be one of the key drivers in trying to gain access to Iraq's oil. And guess where they have great big oil operations? Kazakhstan. Guess the only way to get the oil out of Kazakhstan? Through Afghanistan. This is a great key corporate target that we can all focus on. The Mobilization for Climate Justice is a local network organizing actions October 24th, November 30th. Lots of targets, including the Chevron Corporation. So come to our table at Global Exchange, show Professor Chomsky that activists live here and that you're going to take action when you leave this room. Thank you very much.
You know, another reason why this place is important is because we're just a couple of blocks away from Auto Row, what's left of Auto Row, which is where the civil rights movement in San Francisco had its greatest and largest demonstrations here. And we're just a few blocks from City Hall, where the students were washed down the steps in 1960, but in the process dealt a telling blow to the House Un-American Activities Committee and helped to end McCarthyism in this country. We have a new civil rights movement in the Bay Area here, and the fact that we do, I think, owes a great deal to our next speaker, Steve Williams, who is one of the most brilliant community organizers that we have, not just here in California, but nationally as well, too. It's overwhelmingly a movement of young people who are questioning the basic nature of our system, and that owes a lot to Steve as well, too, who co-authored a book called Towards Land, Work, and Power, which is really a treatise on political economy for young organizers. Steve is the co-founder and co-executive director of POWER, People Organized to Win Employment Rights, which is a multilingual, multiracial membership organization for low-income workers and families who are fighting for economic, gender, and racial justice here in San Francisco. Steve?
So I've been arrested 7 times, mostly in the cause of peace and justice. And I'd first of all just like to congratulate Professor Chomsky for an amazing act of intellectual acrobatics, sort of connecting the crises that are taking place all around the globe right now. And I think it's critical to sort of remember what Antonia is pointing out, that the way that the ruling elite in the United States has responded to these crises is war. And it's not just war abroad, but what we're seeing more and more is that that war is happening inside the borders of the United States. So we already know that the unemployment rates have gone up and up, right? So the unemployment rates in the United States are almost 10%, and that's officially, right, in the country abroad. In the African American community, it's more than 15%. In the Latino community, it's more than 13%. Those are just the official numbers. When we look at those people who are out of the system, or those people who are just piecing together one small part-time job with another small part-time job, the number grows to about 30 million people, larger than the whole population of Canada. Right? And then when we include those 30 million people plus the 45, 46 million people without health insurance in this country, when we look at the rates of housing foreclosures that continue to escalate while financial institutions get trillions of dollars, we understand more and more that the war is happening inside the United States in a different form, with different tools, but happening in a very aggressive way. Now, oftentimes, those of us here in San Francisco like to think, well, we march against the war. We hate most of the stuff that's happening on Wall Street. So we've created a bubble. We've created a sanctuary here in San Francisco. But it's important that we understand that San Francisco is engaged in that war at home as well. Under the leadership of Gavin Newsom, San Francisco has continued the neoliberal policies of attacking low-income and working people in this city. As the city faces tens of billions of dollars in deficit this year, the city has made a deliberate attempt to try to make up some of that deficit by stealing money. I said stealing money from undocumented immigrants. The San Francisco Police Department has been directed to stop anybody who's Latino, see whether they have a driver's license. If they don't have a driver's license, to impound their car. Unlike when we get our cars impounded, undocumented immigrants aren't allowed to get their cars for at least a week. And as a consequence, just to get their cars in order to be able to go do the work, cleaning houses, preparing food, raising people's kids, undocumented immigrants have to pay at least $5,000 to be able to get their car back. The Women of Power have begun an organizing project targeting the San Francisco Police Department and targeting the auto company to stop the racial profiling that's happening in San Francisco right now. But the attacks aren't just happening on the Latino community. Over the last 10 years, the population of African Americans in the city has fallen by more than 60%. The bulk of black people in San Francisco live out in Bayview Hunters Point, a neighborhood that is under the boot of gentrification and displacement, largely by a corporation based in Miami called Lennar. Lennar was granted access to developing luxury condominiums on the site of the old naval shipyard, the same site where the bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima at the end of World War II shipped out of, a land that is riddled with toxic waste. Lennar was able to attain that waterside property for the grand total of $1. Now, I'm sure that we could raise way more than $1 today if we tried to collect money to say that we're interested in developing Bayview Hunters Point, the naval shipyard, in a way to meet the needs of the residents of that neighborhood. But we were never given a choice of pursuing that interest. Instead, Gavin Newsom sold the shipyard for $1 to the Lennar Corporation, and the Lennar Corporation now, in its haste to build luxury condominiums, is saying that they're not going to clean up the toxic waste, but they are instead just going to plow cement over it. That is going to be their process of cleaning up this federally recognized Superfund site. It is critical at this particular stage that all of us call the Board of Supervisors to say that we want an end to the racial profiling that is targeting Latinos in this city. We also want an end to the land grab that is taking place with the Bayview shipyard in order to make sure that people who live in Bayview actually have an opportunity to design their futures and to take back that neighborhood. Now, Professor Chomsky reminds us that ultimately public opinion really doesn't mean anything unless it's organized and mobilized. And so as we make those phone calls, it's critical that people get in contact with power so that we can continue to give you information about what is happening in people's lives. And you can contact us at our website, which is www.peopleorganized.org. Ultimately, I think there was a question put out by the great intellectual Samir Amin, where he said that we're really at a particular point in history where we have to ask ourselves whether we're emerging from a crisis in capitalism or whether we're emerging from capitalism in crisis. The model of economic development that San Francisco has been employing is not just attacking working class people of color in this city. It is attacking the quality of life, the city that all of us love. It is critical that we figure out new models of economic development in order to be able to create a San Francisco that is home to the diversity and to the people who built this city. Thank you.
Well, now it's my turn. I was a union organizer for about 25 years before I started writing and taking pictures for a living, so I still sort of see the world in kind of class, working class terms, and in terms of kind of what the effect is on working people of the broad issues that we're talking about here. And so that's where I want to start, is looking at how the operation of the global system that Dr. Chomsky described, what its impact is on working people, on the grassroots of people around the world. And maybe we could start by looking at Colombia, because we're going to have a free trade agreement with Colombia in Congress next year. and we ought to understand how people in Colombia look at it and what the impact on them it's going to be. Colombia is already a country that's full of refugees, partly because there's been a civil war for the last quarter century there, partly because paramilitaries are killing social activists and trade unionists. 100 trade unionists die every year in Colombia. 3,800 trade unionists have died in Colombia since 1986. Partly because Colombia has been under pressure for decades from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to cut its public sector budget, which in turn causes mass terminations. This January, 42,000 state agency workers alone. The money that Colombia's government saves by cutting social services and people's jobs then gets turned over to foreign banks and lending institutions in order to make Colombia more attractive to foreign investors. The head of the Human Rights Department of the Colombian Union Federation, Edgar Paez, says that even Plan Colombia, the so-called U.S. drug war in Colombia, is really a pretext for protecting transnational investors. He says this creates a much more favorable environment for the exploitation of our natural resources and our labor force, and it also provides support for the implementation of a U.S.-Colombia free trade agreement. A free trade agreement with Colombia essentially is going to recreate the experience of the increased U.S. penetration of Mexico that we saw under NAFTA, or the penetration of Central America under CAFTA, politically, economically, even militarily. What did we see with NAFTA in Mexico? The privatization of foreign corporations, the destruction of people's unions, the mass layoffs of workers. Mexico used as a dumping ground for U.S. agricultural products by some of the largest corporations in the world, subsidized by our farm bill, while at the same time Mexico had to cut its subsidies for its small farmers. A 40% poverty rate, this is the government of Mexico that says this, no program for increasing employment there. So when you ask what is the consequence of a free trade agreement with Colombia going to be, well, what was the consequence of CAFTA and NAFTA before it? What was the consequence of all of these economic reforms? And the main effect it had on working people was it produced displaced people. In fact, displacement is the most important product of these economic policies wherever they're implemented. In the time that NAFTA's been in effect from 1994 to now, 6 million people from Mexico have come to live here in the United States. And year before last, they sent back home $26 billion, which essentially takes the place of the social investment that the Mexican government would ordinarily be responsible for making in its own country. This produces a crisis for working people. That's what the uprising in Oaxaca was all about, that there's no alternative to people other than leaving home and going somewhere else, looking for work and survival. So these trade agreements, they don't stop the flow of migrants, they produce it. And then our immigration policies and laws regulate it. In fact, displacement and migration, they're not some kind of byproduct of trade agreements or this economic system, because our economic system here in the United States is dependent on the labor that this displacement produces. But increasingly, that labor is now being criminalized. We saw all the big raids that the Bush administration had in meatpacking plants in the last couple of years. Now we see mass firings like the 1,800 people at American Apparel in Los Angeles who are losing their jobs. This is the Obama administration's immigration policy. So our Congress and the administration aren't trying to stop migration because nothing can. It's not really about keeping people from crossing the border at all. It's really about making workers vulnerable and unequal, because inequality means lower wages and higher profits for employers. And if you think I'm just blowing smoke, this is the Council on Foreign Relations, which says that the purpose of our immigration reforms should be to reform the legal system so that it operates more efficiently, responds more accurately to labor market needs, and enhances U.S. competitiveness. As a trade unionist, whenever you hear competitiveness, U.S. competitiveness, employers' competitiveness, you know what that means. It means people losing their jobs. It means low wages. So I want to end by asking some questions here, really. Can we really have a movement of solidarity between the people in our country, people like you, like me, ourselves here sitting in this room, with people in Colombia or in Mexico or in Central America that doesn't tackle the basic corporate program on trade and displacement and investment? How can we stop the corporate effort to increase profits and investments in Colombia or Peru or Central America or Mexico, all of the countries where these agreements are in effect, by attacking the standard of living, labor standards, or labor law? How can we work to increase the security of workers and farmers and to reduce displacement and forced migration, but also recognizing that for some time to come, people are still going to be displaced, are still going to be crossing that border, looking for work? How are we going to be able to keep people from being criminalized? How are we going to be able to defend the rights of those workers who are being forced into migration? Thanks. So I think now we're going to give Professor Chomsky a chance to respond to the questions that were raised by our speakers here.
Well, I'd like to exploit the opportunity, but it would be exploiting. I talked too long altogether. I think it would be more constructive to turn it over to the audience.
Well, I think we would like to hear.
Okay. Well, there are a couple of, there's several themes that were brought up which are quite accurate and could be extended. So, Antonia pointed out, among other things, that there's a debate going on about Afghanistan and its policies. There's a kind of a debate going on, but it's sort of a strange one. One voice is missing in the debate: Afghans. They're not supposed to participate. And it's taken for granted, like nobody talks about it. It's our world. We own it. We run it. We'll decide what to do in our interest. And it doesn't mean you and me. It means those who control policy and control the economy. They'll decide, and nobody else's voice matters. It doesn't matter what the American population thinks, and what the Afghans think amounts to zero. At least you see some references to the fact that the U.S. population is opposed. What about the Afghans? They're not supposed to play any part in this decision. Well, it's not that they're silent. They're not silent. For example, there's an Afghan peace movement, pretty significant one. They have some very eloquent spokespersons. We don't know exactly the scale of it because, you don't investigate that kind of thing. You try to count the number of people with guns or something like that, but not the peace movement. But there is information about it. One of the most eloquent spokespersons, if you haven't read her, you should, is Malalai Joya, who's an incredible young woman, I guess not so young anymore, who lived through the Russian occupation, the warlord regime, U.S.-backed warlords after the Russian occupation, tore the country to shreds under the Taleban, who were actually welcomed because the warlords were so monstrous, and under the current regime, which is the warlords again. It's called the Karzai regime. And throughout this whole period, she's been constantly engaged in constructive opposition, things like trying to organize girls' schools in villages, health programs, and so on. How she survived is a miracle. She was elected to the parliament with plenty of support, but continued to criticize the members of the parliament, the warlord gangsters. And she was thrown out of the parliament. She's living underground, heavy protection. But she has a voice. She has a book that just came out a while ago, which is very eloquent. She sometimes speaks. She may be speaking here. But her basic point is the same as that of the Afghan peace movement. What she says is, look, we're perfectly happy to have an invasion from the West, an invasion of schools, hospitals, development. Should be, she doesn't say it, but we should. An invasion of reparations for the crimes we've committed against them. That's a fine invasion, but we don't want an invasion of guns and tanks. That's only going to recreate the horrors. Now we live under the threat of the Taleban, the warlords, the NATO forces, and that's what we want to get rid of. We'll work things out for ourselves somehow. Well, that voice, again, we don't really know how broad it is, but it seems to be significant, and it's silenced. It's silenced because we allow it to be silenced. It shouldn't be. The kind of debate that's going on in Washington should not be permitted to take place. It doesn't matter what your view is, because it's not up to us or Washington to decide what ought to be done in Afghanistan. Invaders have no rights. They only have responsibilities, and that should be understood. Well, that's a voice that's missing. Steve said something actually David in his opening remarks mentioned something quite relevant, which Steve and then David later picked up. He pointed out that the church was at the forefront of eliminating slavery in the United States. But slavery wasn't eliminated in the United States. We know that some amendments were passed during the Second World War, Civil War, but they were never implemented. I mean, they were briefly. There was a period of about 10 years, Reconstruction, when there was sort of semi-freedom, limited freedom for black slaves. It ended in 1877 with a compact between the parties, the North and the South. And what happened after that was criminalizing black life, exactly what both of you talked about, criminalizing the life of the poor, which meant blacks. And it was done, and now it's done by charges of having a joint in your pocket or something, or some other thing. Then it was done by vagrancy or talking too loudly when a white woman is around or some other charge. But effectively, black life was criminalized. And once you were caught in the criminal system, you could never get out of it because you had to pay the costs of the courts, which you couldn't pay, and so it's permanent. So, in fact, a permanent slave labor force was formed by starting 10 years after the Civil War, and that form of slavery was much worse than actual slavery for very good capitalist reasons. In fact, reasons that the slave owners used to justify having slaves, and nobody ever answered their arguments. Their arguments were that owning slaves is more moral than renting people. If you own, to be anachronistic, if you own a car, you're going to take care of it. If you rent a car, chances are you won't take care of it. The car will be better off a couple of years later if it's owned. And that was their argument for slavery, much more moral than what's called free labor, that is renting people. Well, the criminalized system under which black life was criminalized, that created a slave labor force where the owners, the masters, had no responsibility. They had no capital investment in the workforce. So they treated them miserably. If you look at the record, it's much worse than slavery. And it's not a small thing. That's a large part of the core of the American Industrial Revolution that took place in the late 19th, early 20th century. A lot of it was based on slave labor, treated much worse than slavery. That lasted until the Second World War. Second World War, there was a need for what's called free labor. You had to have labor for war industry and so on. So, this second worst kind of slavery kind of ended. And in the early post-war period, it was a period of substantial economic growth, best in economic history, in fact, went on until the 70s. And then there was a need for openings for labor, skilled blue-collar labor. And African Americans had a chance to move into the society and get a job in an auto plant, get a pretty good contract from UAW, buy a house, have a car, and so on. Well, that ended around the mid-'70s with the neoliberal period being initiated. That's a period of financialization of the economy, sending productive capacity abroad because it's more profitable for the owners and managers, setting workers around the world in competition with one another, which of course lowers wages. That's the point of the trade agreements. Meanwhile, protecting professionals so they're not in competition with each other, so they stay wealthy and do fine. And of course, the owners and the managers, riches beyond the dreams of avarice, as we've seen in the last 25 years. That's the World Trade Organization. That's what's called globalization. Well, that ended the options for black Americans quite significantly, except for a small sector that could kind of make it into the, Harvard Law School. But you got to do something with them. These people who are now superfluous. Well, in Colombia, they do something with them. It's called social cleansing, limpieza social. You send out the paramilitaries and you kill them. Well, we're more civilized. So what we do here is throw them into jail by criminalizing the life of the poor, as both of you pointed out. The pretext, you've got to have a pretext. So the pretext is drugs, but nobody can take that seriously. I mean, just as you can't take seriously the drug war in Colombia. Those are just pretexts. It's our form of social cleansing. And if you take a look at African American history, from the day that the first slave was brought here until today, there's been maybe 25 years, maybe 30 years of some form of freedom. And now it's Hispanics as well, and that's the incarceration rate, as you all know, has gone through the skies. That's the history of the poor. Poor and class and race are reasonably correlated in the United States, so it's critically the history of the black and now Hispanic poor. David gave you some of the statistics, and that's showing it. One last comment on this stuff. David mentioned that in the Mexican economy, after it's been essentially destroyed, really on purpose, under the trade agreements, there's, what was the figure for remittances?
26 billion.
26 billion, yeah. 26 billion was a year on... Year before last on remittances. Well, that's approximately a quarter of the Mexican economy. Another roughly a quarter is coming from profits from oil. Another quarter is coming from narco-trafficking. Mexico's probably the narco-trafficking center of the world. There are huge areas right on the U.S. border, so everybody in this government knows about them, which have been taken over by narco-traffickers. A lot of them are places where people were forced off the land because, for the reasons David mentioned, they can't compete with U.S. subsidized agribusiness. So they're empty, or they're driven off. They're taken over by narco-traffickers. They're protected by the military who participate in this. Put all this together, it's adding roughly the same part of the economy as oil and remittances. That's the Mexican economy. Well, you can't study it in Mexico. Any editor or journalist will tell you, we can't write about it, or it's a death warrant. If we try to write about it, we're going to be killed. It's worse than Colombia in this respect. But a lot of people know about it. I mentioned David. I happened to be there about 10 days ago, and I was reading the press, and there was a study that came out by two well-known and respected economists condemning the drug war in Mexico's Calderon's drug war, which we're supposed to think is great. They said it's a total farce because it's avoiding the main participants in the drug war, the government and the corporations. They said that corporations, which are big ones, involved in 80% of the economy, they're running the narco-trafficking and making a lot of profit out of it. Mexico doesn't get decertified. Decertification is a blow to countries in Latin America. They suffer from it. Obama just announced decertification for last year. And guess who was decertified? Bolivia and Venezuela. And there's no evidence that they're participating in maybe there's something going on, but minor. Nothing like Colombia, nothing like Mexico, but they're not decertified because that's a farce like everything else. Just as the criminalization of the population here under the drug war is just old history. That's the way you deal with superfluous populations that you either want to turn into a labor force, and the criminalized population today is a labor force, forced labor, or you just don't have anything to do with it. Well, those are things we got to face.
Well, I'm afraid that Professor Chomsky has to catch an airplane. We were told to make sure that he is able to leave in time to get to the airport. So we don't have time for more than this. I know that we would all like to go on for another hour or two, both listening to Professor Chomsky and hearing what you all have to say, and I'm sorry we can't do that today. But I would like to give him one last San Francisco welcome and one last expression of our gratitude.
You've been listening to a special program featuring renowned linguist, social justice activist, author, and lecturer Noam Chomsky, speaking at the First Unitarian Universalist Society in San Francisco, California on October 4th, 2009. The title of the program is Crisis and Hope in the Age of Obama. Also speaking were the policy analyst and author Antonia Juhasz, community organizer and author Steve Williams, and labor journalist David Bacon. Introducing the program were Greg Stewart, senior minister at the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, and Dolores Perez Priam, event organizer and activist, also of the First Unitarian Universalist Society. To find out more about the speakers and the topics discussed during this program, please visit the following websites: the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco at uusf.org, People Organized to Win Employment Rights at peopleorganized.org, Antonia Juhasz's website at tyranny-of-oil.org, David Bacon's website at dbacon.igc.org, and the Noam Chomsky website at chomsky.info. PDX Media Productions would like to thank Dolores Perez Priam and Jonathan Silk for their invaluable assistance in producing this program. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions of Portland, Oregon. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free, on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find programs featuring speakers such as Barbara Ehrenreich, Amira Haas, Paul Krugman, Jeremy Scahill, and many, many others. And write to us with your comments and questions at pdxjustice@riseup.net. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in,